Hello, this is the Provoked Prawn, here to compare the Corsair 2500D Airflow with the Lian Li O11 Air Mini, seen here on the right with the Corsair case on the left. Now if I put these two cases side by side, you'll see they're very similar and quite comparable in a number of different ways. They both have obvious airflow focus with mesh panels and lots of potential there. They're both also able to be filled up with a variety of fans, and I've built in both of them in a number of different formats and in a variety of ways. So I want to show you the things that I've discovered with both of them, things I like and don't like about them, and compare the features of them so you can consider these options before you buy, and perhaps it will help you make a decision. Now, I have reviewed the Corsair 2500D Airflow, and I'll link to that video down below. And I've done a lot of different content with the Air Mini because I've been using that for quite some time. You can see it here filled up with Lian Li's Infinity reverse blade fans and standard format fans, and a very nice cooler setup with the Galahad with that nice infinity mirror on it. And you'll see that this is potentially a very nice looking case and a compact one, and yet you're able to fit up to an ATX motherboard in there, so it really fills up that space. Corsair's 2500D is interesting in a number of ways because it also supports rear panel motherboards, and I'll talk about that later on as we go through. And as you'll see, it too has loads of different air panels on it, including the rear one, which allows you to get loads of good airflow for your power supply unit, for all your fans, radiators, and your hard drives and other things in there as well. And you can also fill it up with up to a 360mm radiator or a 240 on the side mounted there, as you can see, and a variety of fan options too. These are both very well constructed cases, hefty, durable, and really nice to work with, and I liked both of them a lot. And when I started to review the 2500D, I just immediately thought of the Air Mini. And the Air Mini has been around in my house for quite some time, and I've built in it in various different formats, both with Noctua's fans and air format, a Fantex cooler, Lian Li's coolers, various different fan layouts and configurations, different motherboards. And I found this case to be reliable, quiet, superb in terms of performance and just looks and aesthetics, and it's just pleasant all round for a number of reasons. It comes as standard with 3 fans, 2 140mm fans on the front and 1 120mm fan on the rear. They're not RGB fans, but they do give good cooling performance, and that obviously is a benefit if you're buying a case initially and you aren't too bothered about replacing the fans, as I've done with a lot of them. Whereas the 2500D from Corsair doesn't come with any fans as standard. The expectation here is that you'll want to use your own fans, so Corsair's opted to not include any fans, so you don't have to worry about wasting the standard fans that they might have included by throwing them out and replace them with whatever fans you're choosing to, which makes some sense. The panels, as you can see, will pop off and are able to be removed, and there's a nice bit of mesh on there, both internally and externally, and I'll get to that in a little while. And you'll see when you break down the 2500D that there are various different things of interest here. Now this case will fit 2 different sizes of motherboards. You've got MATX and ITX options, and the ITX is pretty tiny, as you can see. So this is a gigabyte board, which I used in a smaller, more compact case, and putting it in here probably looks a bit daft, but you can see that you can do it if you want to. And then you have loads of room for cable management, but there is a bit of a mess there, I think. I don't think this is the best option. The better option is something like MSI's Project Zero motherboard, which are back connect motherboards, so all the connections are on the rear. Now the 2500D has the advantage here over the Air Mini because this case is designed specifically for this, which is why you have all those holes on the motherboard tray around where the motherboard slots on top of. Because when you install the motherboard and slot it into place, those connectors are obviously now visible at the back, and you can then plug in everything you need to from there, hide away your cables, and end up with a much neater affair at the front. This does mean that you need to work harder on the cable management at the rear, cable tidying and such, which I haven't done here, but you do need to, because obviously you're exposing a lot of those connectors to the rear, so if you have cables sort of pressing against them, there's potential problems there. But it does mean that you can get a really clean build at the end of it. As you can see from this front shot, there's barely any cables at all at the front of the case now, with the exception of the all-in-one cooler and then the GPU as well. So you can really have things looking very neat at the front, and that's certainly a benefit to that design because it looks pretty fantastic. There are, however, some downsides to it. For example, the hard disk drive cage that goes in the top right-hand side, I found that this then pressed up against those power connectors on the motherboard when you've got this rear-facing design, which then means potentially you either have to abandon the hard disk drive cage entirely or take the risk that it's going to be pressing against those connectors and could cause damage to the cables or other problems in the long run. So not ideal, something to bear in mind if you are thinking about buying it and you want to use hard disk drives or SSDs. So that's something. However, I do really like the fact that it'll take that back connect motherboard, and obviously the Air Mini won't, because that is a newer style of motherboard and the Air Mini is a bit older now, so it's not designed to handle that sort of thing. And the format of this is pretty straightforward in terms of installing things, but there are some caveats to it, and I went into a lot of depth on my review of the 2500D talking about these various things to bear in mind. Despite its small size, the Air Mini is actually pretty capable and very roomy. I was really surprised by this when I initially got it, because I'd done the Mini Snow Edition before that as a build, and that required a small form factor power supply unit. The Air Mini, by comparison, is able to take up to an ATX motherboard, so that's pretty standard motherboard size, which the 2500D Airflow can't take. So that's something to keep in mind, that you have to buy a smaller motherboard, which then means that you lose out on some things potentially. For example, this ROG motherboard that I'm fitting in here can take multiple NVMe SSDs, whereas the smaller Project Zero motherboard couldn't. So you make some sacrifices. However, this is obviously a front connect motherboard, so you can have more cables around the front. And with the ATX design, you'll see it does fill up a lot of the case, so plugging in some of the cables becomes a little bit more fiddly. You have less space at the top to plug things in, and it's a little bit tighter up there, as you can see once you get behind the fans. So you need to plan out the build a bit more, plug in the cables to the motherboard first before you start trying to put other things in, and keep that in mind. But one of the things that's interesting is the fan layout. So you can have 320mm fans on the bottom of this case, despite the specs saying you could only put 220mm or 240mm fans at the bottom. It is possible to do that, and they do sit very wide, so they fill up a lot of the space down there, and some overhang from the tray, because really you're only meant to put two in the bottom part of it, which is worth bearing in mind. You can put 320mm fans on the top and two 120 or 140 mils on the front. Obviously, I'll leave the specs in the description, but as you can see, it fills up a lot of the room down there, and then you just screw it in from below, where there is a dust filter, which you can pull out to protect the dust ingress and prevent that there. But as you can see, once you've sort of put a 240mm radiator on the rear, 120mm fans all throughout here, 3 on top, 3 on the bottom, 2 on the front, it really fills up the case, and just every sort of portion of the case is maximized in terms of what's in there. So you're really making the most of the space inside what is otherwise a pretty small case. But as I said, a little bit fiddly with the motherboard connectors because you haven't got quite so much room there. But I do think it still looks neat at the end of the day, and it's amazing what you can cram into there and still get good airflow. The 2500D is a little bit different because that offers the ability to put 320mm fans on the bottom, so you can see you can do that here as well. And what I found though that was interesting is there's a little bit of a gap on either side, so you can put 240mm down here or 320mm, and the same logic for the top, but it doesn't fill up the space quite so much. So if you look at the Air Mini, you'll see how those 120mm fans are basically edge to edge, front to back, right touching the edges there, which I personally prefer. From a build perspective, it makes life a little bit easier because you haven't got to think about where they are in the case, and also aesthetically it looks a bit nicer, but this is going to be a personal preference. And the 2500D by comparison has more room around the bottom there, where you've got gaps on either side of the fans. So I found, for example, once I mounted them, I had to sort of slide them around to where I wanted them to be and to work out the logic of the positioning to have a good aesthetic and still be blowing nicely. Now, obviously, if you're going for a custom system, custom loop in there, for example, it gives you a bit more flexibility having that additional space, so that might be beneficial. But the same thing occurs at the top as well as space up there. Now, this isn't a major complaint. I think it's not going to be a massive problem. It's just one of the differences between them. As I said, the Air Mini, actually, the specs say that you can only fit two 120mm fans at the bottom or 240, so you can see a variance of that here. I don't think that looks as nice, and then you've got loads of space down there. Now, with the 2500D, you'll see you've got this massive mesh rear panel that you can take off. Again, there's a material on the inside of that to help with dust management, which I'll get to in a little while. And then you've got this rear area to build in. Both the cases are dual chamber, so in theory you've got enough space to build in there. The thing that's pretty cool about this case is it will take either ATX power supply unit or a small form factor power supply. So you can see a 1500 watt Corsair PSU in here, and just sort of how much space there is left after that. Or alternatively, you can go for a much smaller small form factor one. There's different sort of mounting logic for them and how they install. There's an additional bracket for the small form factor one, which you can see once it's installed here. And there are benefits to doing either. For example, small form factor makes more sense with a rear connect motherboard because the cables are shorter, and obviously you don't have to stretch those cables quite so far when you're plugging them in at the rear. So it's something to bear in mind if you're thinking about buying that. Maybe the small form factor is worth it, not just for the extra space you get in terms of the wiring at the rear, but just how you're connecting these up. Alternatively, if you try and use a small form factor with the front connect motherboard, as I've done here, I found that the cables were a little bit difficult and there were some things that were problematic. For example, I've had to take the hard disk drive cage out in order to put the power supply cables into the CPU connectors on the motherboard, so the EPS ones, and also the cables are a little bit shorter to run to the front, because it's not really like an ITX case. It's not a small, tiny case. It's still reasonably sized, as you've seen with the comparisons, so something there that is interesting. And the other thing that I found is, sadly, Corsair hasn't got any cable channeling here. There's no Velcro ties of any sort with the cable management. There are, however, a lot of loops through here, and you do get a lot of plastic cable ties. So you do have to get a lot hands-on with the cable management and tying cables down, both the standard front panel connectors that you can see me dealing with here, and then any other cables that you're plugging in. Now, with the rear connect motherboard, that's going to be especially important because obviously you've got all these additional cables at the rear of your case. You can see the power connectors, for example, but also fan headers and other things. And as I mentioned, that's going to be problematic with the hard disk drive cage, not just getting those connectors in there, but also making sure you're not putting pressure on those as well over time, which could then lead to some issues and potentially be a big problem. So that is one issue with this design. And as you'll see, if you're thinking of lots of storage for your build, so lots of hard disk drives or SSDs, then the Corsair 2500D isn't necessarily the best option out of these two. You can put two hard disk drives in this cage or two SSDs, and there are two other mounting points for two more SSDs. I'll show you in a second. But actually, there's a lot more storage options in the Air Mini, and this becomes particularly problematic, as you'll see with this rear connect motherboard, because you probably have to abandon this hard disk drive cage, and then you lost that storage potential there. However, it is possible to do. You can do it, and you can close the door, and this door does hide away that cable shame. However, it is also still visible through there. Now, the Air Mini has a removable metal panel, and I want to mention there are no dust shields on here, so there's no magnetic dust shields and there's no material. It's just the metal. So over time, some dirt does get through in my experience, but it is easier to clean. It also has this removable support bracket on the back there, which is not only good for hiding your cables away, but also is multifunctional because you can mount SSDs on that. The other thing you'll notice is that when you take this off, the fan tray on the side actually has some plates on there, and in a second I'll show you what those are for. Then you can also mount an ATX power supply in here with relative ease, so there's plenty of space in there for a larger power supply unit and still plenty of room for your cables. At the top you have a hard disk drive cage where you can mount two hard disk drives or two SSDs, and there are various different points around the case where you can install different things in there. There's lots of options for storage and then for cooling potential as well. The other thing you'll notice is we do have Velcro ties in this case for tiny cables down. So as standard, you've got those cables ready to install in there, so you can just tidy things up immediately and just have those hooked in. Obviously, this case doesn't support a rear connect motherboard though, so you are limited in your options, and it's not without its problems. You'll see that the hard disk drive cage is blocking the back of the motherboard, so if you need to access the tray there, then that's going to be an issue. Now, as I mentioned, plugging in the power connectors is a little bit more fiddly. You can see, even with nothing in there apart from the motherboard, that there's not much space at the top to plug in the top power cables and then other things. So this becomes an issue when you're trying to connect in like AIO pump headers and things later on when you've got a radiator installed. I remember that being a big problem. And obviously you've got a lot more cables at the front. However, the fact that it supports the ATX motherboard makes it a bit more standard, in that most cases will support an ATX motherboard, and that's pretty much the standard format of motherboards, so they're a bit easier to access, and that makes it more appealing in my mind. Now, once you've got things in there, you can see even with a big cably mess, there's still plenty of room to hide things away, and that cable hiding tray really helps with that, because it's not only a support bracket, but it also blocks off the view in there. It's perhaps not as important to neaten things up in this case. I did find it quite roomy. It really surprised me how roomy it is for its size, and the same can be said about both of them, but just cable management in the Air Mini is a bit easier, I think. Easier in that it's easier to do, but if you want to get really hands-on with the plastic ties and tying things down in a way that they're fully secured, then the 2500D wins in that regard. The Air Mini doesn't have as big an air panel. As you can see, it's just got two lots of perforated holes down here, but obviously enough for the hard disk drives, power supply, and your fans or radiator or whatever you're doing there. 2500D storage-wise, there's a panel at the rear here that you take off, and then you can access the cage from the rear as well. It's not hot swappable because you'd have to unplug the cables first, but you can then pull the drives out once they're installed into here. You can install either two hard disk drives, as I'm doing here, basically it clips into place and then can be screwed in as well and secured that way, or alternatively SSDs. Now, I've already thought about whether you're using a rear connect motherboard or not, but that installation is pretty straightforward otherwise, because once it's in that tray, you just slide it back in and then you plug the cables in from the other side. However, that cage is blocking the back of the motherboard, so if you need to, for example, put a mounting bracket on for an all-in-one cooler and access the rear of the motherboard, you'll need to take that cage out first of all. On the left-hand side of the case, you've got the SSD mounting brackets. There are just two of them, and in my opinion, they're in a bit of a strange place because they're positioned basically where the fan tray would be or where the radiator tray is going to be. But the installation is really straightforward. You just put some screws through that into the SSD, and then you just mount it back on there really easily. You run the power cables and the data cables over to them, and as you can see, that then leads to a little bit of mess there. Now, if you have the fan tray mounted in the right position, it's not necessarily that much of a problem. There's two mounting positions for it, but some of the cables are visible from the front. Alternatively, you can take them out and then you can put them into the cages as I've shown, and then put them into the hard disk drive bay instead. I think this is probably preferable, but as you can see, this limits your options. You really are limited in how many drives you can install and where you're going to install them, depending on what you're doing with the build, because once you install an all-in-one cooler, for example, to the side fan tray, then that becomes a bit of an issue. Or if you're just installing fans, these are a bit more visible, so that's a shame, and maybe you only end up using the cage. Now, the Air Mini, by comparison, as you'll see, has multiple mounting points. So you can put an SSD on this side fan tray, for example, in two different positions. So you can put them there if you want to. Alternatively, you could put two in that rear cage, and then also you could put two on this bracket as well. So you have the space to be able to install 6 SSDs in here if you want to, which is pretty nuts for a fairly compact case. Alternatively, some of those brackets can also be used for hard disk drives. So this bracket you see me putting the SSD on and attaching to the side of the case, you can put hard drives on there instead. So that's pretty nuts. And the installation is also really easy because you have washers and screws, and then it just basically slips into place on this bracket, for example, or screws in more to the fan tray. Now, obviously, if you're using the fan tray for actually fans, then you don't have as many options. You're actually taking a couple away. But you do have a lot of flexibility here. Hard disk drives equally can be installed in that cage that you saw. They have some anti-vibration mountings on them as well as the standard screws, which Corsair doesn't. I haven't been able to test to see whether that makes a big difference in terms of the noise that comes from them, but it is something to keep in mind. If you're worried about drive noise, then the Air Mini may be a bit better because it does have those anti-vibration mounts and washers on there, and then the drive slips in. But you can see the bay logic is basically the same and in the same position. Now you've got this removable fan tray on the Corsair 2500D. That fan tray can obviously be used as a radiator tray instead, and it's actually mountable in two different positions in the case. You have it right up against the back, like it was there as standard, and you can put it further forward towards the front of the case. You can put a radiator on there, as I am this 240mm radiator, and then install it from the rear. Now I want to say that I found this really fiddly to do, depending on where you're putting it in. If you're putting it in the rear position, it's pretty easy, although you can see me having problems here, but in theory it's pretty easy. It has some notches on the bottom of the tray, and then it screws in at the top and secures into place. It was a little bit fiddly to do because for some reason this right hand bracket is getting in the way a little bit. But once you've got it in and wiggled it in, it does look quite nice there. Now, it is sitting quite far back, which is one of the things I noticed. Alternatively, you can actually mount it a little bit further forward. Now, with just fans on that bracket, I found that it has a mounting position that lets you put it further into the case, which then means you can sit it further forward, which is probably preferable because it will hide the SSDs away a bit more and the cabling for those, so they're not as visible from the front if you're doing this. And that is obviously a better option potentially as well, aesthetically wise and airflow wise, because the fans are closer to the front of the case. It just looks a bit nicer. I've got them all set to intake here, for example, so both the front and side are pulling. However, while doing this, I realized there was potentially space to do a push-pull setup with the radiator. So if you have a radiator on here, you could probably put two 120mm fans at the rear on the back of the radiator, as well as two on the front, both facing the same way to then improve the airflow and get better cooling for your CPU. In theory, what you then do is you put the fan tray deeper into the case in that same position I showed you a second ago, and then mount the fans to the rear as well as to the front, and then it should work. However, what I found is with the combo I was using, the fans are a little bit thicker, which meant they pressed up against the fans at the front of the case, and therefore it just wouldn't work. Now, with the Air Mini, the bracket for that isn't removable, so you just install your radiator to that fan tray or your fans, obviously removing those hard disk drive cage things that I showed you earlier on, and then you'd set it up like this. Now there's plenty of space in there, as you can see, and the sort of standard format for it is quite nice. What I noticed is also it sits quite far forward, as you can see, so it's not right on the back. So potentially you could do a push-pull setup in there. I haven't actually done it with this case, but usually with Lian Li's cases, in my experience, there is enough room to put additional fans at the rear as well as at the front. So you could potentially do push-pull there, and it's really easy because that tray is not removable, so it's static and in place there. But what you can see, obviously, is you still have the fan tray at the front as well, which sticks into the case a little bit. So it might be problematic depending on what you're doing, but I haven't noticed any issues when I've been installing things in there. I've done various different builds in this case now without any problems. So you can see both cases have lots of different options and flexibilities in terms of where you're mounting things. As well as mounting a 240mm all-in-one cooler to the side, you also have the option to mount a 360mm radiator to the top in the 2500D, which you can't do in the Air Mini. Now, one problem that I did come across with the 2500D is the air panels. So this front mesh panel, for example, not only has a lot of holes in it, but when I put it back on, I found it was making a lot of noise. And the reason for that is because it has this inner mesh, which, as you can see, moves around. Obviously, this will be good for collecting dust over time and preventing that from getting in the case. And that's something the Air Mini doesn't have. But what I found is if you accidentally ruck it up, when you put it back into the case, you'll find that it results in a pretty horrible noise, which is less than ideal. And I think when you're cleaning it in long term, you'll probably find this is a problem. Now, it is easy to sort out because you can just flatten that out, but it is something to keep in mind that is potentially an issue. And that isn't necessarily a major one, though. The panels all have that sort of logic to them, so there should be good protection from dust ingress, I think, and that's definitely beneficial as well. That's something the Air Mini doesn't have. but they do all have good dust trays. So you can see you can tug this one out on the bottom of the 2500D, and the Air Mini has a similar sort of logic with the bottom panel, which is going to be the biggest point for dust ingress anyway. But the Air Mini just doesn't have anything here. You see you've got the standard metal panels with no additional magnetic or otherwise dust filters on there. The airflow is probably better because of this, but dust may well be an issue over time. Indeed, it has been. I have had to clean it out a few times when I've done different builds in it, but not so much that it's clogging things up, although that's going to depend on how filthy you are. So you can see advantages and disadvantages to both, and things of interest about both as well. Another one about the 2500D is that you can buy additional panels for it. So you can get these wood effect panels, which can replace the standard ones. So you can pop off the top panel and a front panel, and then a couple of other ones around it as well, and you can replace it with these wood effect panels that give it a different look. The installation is fairly straightforward, although I would recommend doing it before you build the PC. I found that was a bit problematic afterwards, but this means that you can then customize the look and feel of the case a bit more. So if that's something you're keen on doing, if you want to personalize the design of your case, then the 2500D Airflow has that option, and it is a pretty nice option and does make it look really nice. So in conclusion, two fantastic cases in their own rights for very different reasons. If you want a really clean aesthetic, the 2500D is the better one if you use a back connect motherboard, in my opinion. It ends up looking really nice. I will say, however, that I did find it a pain to build in. It is frustrating in various different ways, and there are a lot of things to keep in mind when doing so. The Air Mini, by comparison, is a little bit easier to build in and has more options in terms of storage for hard drives and things like that. Although you can't get as big a radiator in there, it still ends up being a really nice case. So they're both fantastic, they're both great, and they're both compact, yet have great airflow, great looks, and plenty of style. If you found this video useful, check out the links in the description to see more related content on both these cases, and thanks very much for watching. You've made it right to the end of the video, you brilliant legend you. If you've enjoyed it, click that subscribe button, give me a thumbs up, and drop me a comment down below if you've got any questions. If you really enjoyed it, consider joining the channel and see the benefits of doing so. Check out these other videos, you might well find them interesting or useful, and most importantly, have a great life.